many of the folks, my friends here in Europe, love Mr. Obama. Mr. Obama is now busy re-engineering and reigniting the productivist, growth-based, consumerist, hyper-consumerist model to get the American economy going again. But that model is exactly the problem for environmentalists. And Mr. Obama, though he speaks wonderful words about environmentalism, is in fact engaged inside the econometric, the economist's paradigm, the economist's silo, with people like Larry Summers and Peter Orszag and Tim Geithner, who only, as economists, think that what you've got to do is restart the growth engine, whereas over in the environmental realm, we know the growth engine is part of the problem, not part of the solution. But there, the Department of the Treasury, understandably, and Wall Street, understandably, are occupying that space in the economic silo. There's another, so we have economics with growth, we have psychology with happiness, we have culture. That's a third domain, not just for anthropologists, but people who do identity politics. And culture, of course, values identity. And there's been some discussion this week about the extinction of identity, the danger that whole cultural identities will go extinct, languages will go extinct. There's a whole nother, that's a whole nother set of values. It's not growth, it's not happiness, it's identity. And again, it's a competing, important value, but it stands in tension with the others. And the reality of human existence from the beginning has been value tension. And each of us in each of our domains, whether we're in the environmental domain or the economic domain, try to prioritize ours and say, well, the others are interesting, but growth is what counts, says the economist. The others are useful, but in a day of global peril, environmental protection is what's paramount. Or cultural identity is what is paramount. Or come to the one that most concerns me as a political scientist, politics. The paradigm of politics is not per se interested in growth. It's not interested in happiness, although the pursuit of happiness found its way into the Declaration of Independence as a surrogate for property. It used to be the pursuit of life, liberty, and property, and Jefferson was smart enough to say happiness is a better term than property, but property is actually what it's about. But politics has been a powerful domain in which the paradigm of independence has been absolutely crucial. And that brings me to the second part of the paradigm. So these paradoxes of the domains, the many different domains, each with its own values, each with its own way of seeing the world, and each reluctant to share either the methodology, the epistemology, or the values of the other. But now come to the second, the domain of politics, because there is where the mythology of independence has been and remains absolutely powerful and absolutely an impediment to environmental solutions to climate change. 300 years ago, a little less, in North America, British colonists declared their independence. And they said in that famous document that those who wished to secure their liberty, their safety, and their property had no better refuge than independence. To live under a sovereign government constituted by the people, which would protect and uphold their rights. Sovereignty, democracy, and liberty became deeply attached to the paradigm of sovereign autonomy. And it still is today. New emerging nations, rogue nations trying to get a real identity, places like Iraq and Afghanistan are looking for what? Their sovereign independence. The U.S. went into and abrogated the sovereignty of Iraq to provide it, supposedly, with real independence. And the Iraqis are now saying, give it to us. Without our independence, we cannot be free, we cannot be democratic. Yet, of course, that very notion, 300 years of being wedded to the idea that independence secures the blessings of liberty, national safety, and security, has in fact given way to a new reality. The reality is we live in a world whose challenges, this is the lessons of the environmental movement, but not just, also the lessons of disease, the lessons of terrorism, the lessons of war, the lessons of global markets. The reality is every challenge we face today is a challenge that crosses borders, a challenge of interdependence. All of our problems are problems of interdependence. All of our solutions are demarcated by the sovereign nation independent state. And then we wonder at the asymmetry. Why can't we solve the problems? There's a lot of disdain for Mr. Bush, but Mr. Bush was actually a loyal and ardent defender of American sovereignty and American independence. He thought, just the way we did in 1941 when we were attacked at Pearl Harbor, we thought that if the United States was attacked, as we were at 9/11, there had to be another country, a nation state out there. If you make war on the nation state that attacked you, you rectify the injustice and you secure your frontiers. He looked for a 19th century solution to a 21st century problem of terrorism. Al-Qaeda, of course, was not a rogue state or a nation state. It's a malevolent NGO. It stands outside of the nation-state system, and it turns out that the power of the United States, with all of its extraordinary hard power to impact Al-Qaeda, has been almost nil. We can take out our armies, we can take out the Air Force, we can take out the Republican Guard, but we have been unable to touch that because we're a nation-state with traditional armies fighting a new form of interdependent terrorism. All our problems then, including environmentalism, are problems that are interdependent and cross borders, and every one of our responses is circumscribed by borders for virtuous reasons, for good reasons. I mean, to this day, everybody wants their own state, their own independent way of looking at things. So the politics of interdependence have created this deep asymmetry. Even the United Nations is an association of sovereign states. And the Secretary General's office has never really been very functional because of the dysfunction of the idea of an assembly of nation states, each defined by its own sovereignty, which then are supposed to act together across their borders. It just hasn't worked. Third and last paradox of the independence paradigm is what I would call temporal independence. We have historically, generation by generation, and this is deeply embedded in the idea of democratic majorities, we have thought that each generation, which is on Earth at any one moment, has the right to everything before it on Earth, whether it's safety, liberty, property, or environmental security. And that means that this generation thinks and feels it has a right to what is here now. Edmund Burke, a couple hundred years ago, argued that the problem with democracy is that it wasn't really a very representative system. It represented, he said, the living, but it represented neither the dead, who were gone, who outnumbered the living, nor the unborn, who were still to come. Who votes for the dead? Who votes for the unborn? Burke had a notion. He said, well, tradition votes for the dead, the traditions and precedents that have been established by those who came before, which is why he didn't think you could break with precedent and tradition easily, because tradition wasn't some stale, cold convention of the past. It was the living emblem of the vote of all those who had come before and established those institutions. But the unborn are even more problematic because everybody talks about the future, but in fact, there's no way the future can vote. We'd have no problem with environmentalism today as a problem if the future could vote, because we know where they'd vote, because they'd say we want an Earth to inherit should we get here. But they don't actually vote. We depend on the imagination, we depend on the goodwill, the altruism of people who somehow imagine, I want my children and my grandchildren. That's a shibboleth, my children and grandchildren. What I really mean about my children and grandchildren is right now. You know, what school are they going to do? Will they have a good job? And that comes back to growth, that comes back to happiness, that comes back to identity. It doesn't particularly come back to environmentalism per se, whose consequences, particularly in the developed world, we're pretty well insulated from. This creates, of course, the tremendous problem of generational justice, of past and future. And this comes back to the problem, and I'm going to sum it up. This comes back to the problem. I'm taking a little more time, though, because I was asked to come and really put this paradigm on the table. And it's why I'm trying to do it this morning. This creates the problem of now trying to figure out how those in the past who have extracted from the earth the best of its resources to get where we are now can deny to those who aren't there the same rights to extract from a now exhausted earth the same thing to get down the line. And I don't have an easy answer to that. I don't know how you tell India and China and Nigeria and Brazil, you know, we did it badly, we did it at tremendous cost to the environment, at such a cost, in fact, that frankly, we can't afford to have you do it. You just can't do it. I only know of one answer, and that's, of course, redistribution.